So hello there and welcome to another tutorial. My name is Tanmay, and this time we're going to be going over how you can use TwitterKit and of course the Watson Natural Language Understanding Service in order to create an application of mine that I like to call tSOMA, or Tanmay's Social Media Analyzer. Now the point of this application is for you to be able to track the sentiment of different posts of users on social media over time regarding a certain search query. Now this is applicable to absolutely any social media platform. In fact, if you were to apply the visual sentiment developed by Facebook, you can actually go ahead and even do this on Instagram and many other kinds of social media as well. However, for now, I'm going to be focusing on textual social media, and in this case, Twitter, but you can very easily expand this to Facebook or practically any other kind of social media that uses text because it's a very simple API integration, and of course with this search. So let's begin. Now, in essence, this is going to be created in an iOS application. We're going to be using a third-party library in order to display a graph of sentiment over time, and let me show you a little bit more of what's actually going on in the back end when you're developing and actually using this application. Let's begin. Alright, so now to begin, of course, we've got an iOS front end. This enables us to develop the application really quickly because it's simple doing the iOS development, and of course allows us to display a lot of information because it's a very easy to use touch interface. So let's just say we've got an iOS interface, and of course this is running Swift. Now, of course, I could use Watson through the iOS SDK. However, in this case, I've decided to use a Llama, for which I do have quite a few different tutorials, in order to create a version that uses the REST API for Watson. So these are actually going through raw HTTP that are wrapped by Llama instead of using the Watson Developer Cloud SDK. It's a little bit easier to set up and get installed because it's compatible with CocoaPods, and you don't need to go through the entire Carthage setup. And so soon I'll be telling you also in a separate video how exactly you can install the Watson Developer Cloud SDK, but that's for another video. Alright, so we've got iOS, we've got Watson, and finally we've got the last piece, which is the social media platform. Now, in this case, the one that I've found usually works the best is Twitter. And the reason why is because I've seen numerous different examples of it in action. Like, for example, a little while ago, actually some time ago, Google Drive, a service that I'm sure you've all heard of, went down. And as you can imagine, millions of people like yourself are going on Twitter and publishing hashtag Google Drive down with a lot of negative sentiment. In fact, you can see on screen right now a bunch of the different examples of different tweets that people had. And the people of Twitter were having some really interesting reactions to it, basically. And so Twitter usually works the best because of its trend system and the way it uses hashtags compared to other social media websites. So in this case, Twitter is the one that I'm beginning with. However, you can use any social media platform that you desire as long as it has an API that allows you to search. And of course, once you actually sign up for a version of the Twitter API or a Twitter developer account, and if you actually incorporate the OAuth login, you will actually get a higher quota, and so it'll work out for around 2 minutes on continuous streaming. And so essentially, the way this works is we have a timer on the iOS application. Now, what the timer is going to do is every, say, 2 seconds, and you can adjust the interval by a second less or more, but say, by default, every 2 seconds, the iOS application is going to query Twitter. And so it's actually going to send over an HTTP request over to Twitter, and this is through its SDK, because again it can be installed through CocoaPods, so it's very, very easy to get set up. And so through their SDK, we send an HTTP request over to TwitterKit, or over to Twitter through TwitterKit, and then Twitter is going to get back to us with a bunch of posts on a certain search query. So it'll get back to us with posts. Now, once the iOS application has posts, it does some very, very simple pre-processing, just removes a few Unicode characters, just a few things that Watson may not like, and then, once it's got posts, it's actually really simple. All you do is you use the iOS application to send over those posts to Watson. Again, we're doing this through HTTP, and then Watson's going to analyze them using the natural language understanding service, and this is where the interesting part comes in. You see, in this case, I could have used the sentiment analysis service. However, the reason I didn't decide to do that is because of one specific reason. And that is that with Watson NLU, see, with NLU, I get something called an emotion score. I don't get sentiment, I get emotion. Now, what's the difference, you may say? Well, with emotion, I get one single value and its floating point, and it's a range of -1 to 1. And so basically, -1 is very negative, +1 is positive, and 0 is kind of neutral. It's in between, doesn't really matter kind of thing. And so it gives me one individual value. When I'm working with sentiment analysis service though, that's going to give me 5 different values. It's going to give me anger, fear, disgust, sadness, and joy. And so these 5 values can be used for more intricate analysis if you would prefer that. However, it's easier for people generally to see positive, negative emotion than for humans to visually have to see 5 different emotions on a graph. It really isn't that easy to use for a human. Therefore, I prefer the one value, and of course, because it's on such a simple scale, we can easily graph it out. And plus, our graphing library is great, because what it allows us to do is actually have, say, a graph, have the middle be a 0, have the bottom be -1, the top be a +1, and then what I can actually do is make it so that when the line is in the middle, it's blue, so when the line's in the middle, it's blue, and so as it actually goes up, it will continue to be blue, because of course it's positive, and of course whatever changes there are. But then, as it starts to go down, let's just say at this moment Google Drive went down. It'll actually start to go down right as it reaches 0, and then right after that, it's going to be red because it's in the negatives, and you will see the red. And so it's just a great graphical interface, and so it works out absolutely perfectly. Watson fits in perfectly with our Graph SDK, no extra processing required, so it's very, very convenient. And so that's exactly why we're using natural language understanding instead of sentiment analysis, just in case you were wondering. And so back to the flow, right as Watson gets back to us with the emotion, then right as we get the emotion back, we then just go ahead and do a little bit of processing on the information that it gives back to us in JSON, and right after that, we're able to show the graph and update the graph, and of course we can have the graph scroll as we get more and more values and have the user interact with it in touch. And so that was the beginning. There's still a bit more though. There's a feature called outline tweets. Now, what is outline tweets? Well, imagine this. Let's just say our sentiment is in this range over here. Alright, so that's where our range is here. Now, what you can do is you can basically, say, draw a little circle or create a little radius around a certain sentiment value, or the average sentiment value. If, by chance, let's just say, there's someone tweeting something really negative about Google Drive, whereas the average sentiment is really positive, you'll find out in the outline tweets section. Or, let's just say there's some kind of movie that people just do not like. Well, in that case, you can go ahead and find people who do like the movie by going to the outline tweets section. If people are sort of mixed, and 50% of people do not like it, 50% of people do like it, then it'll show you the tweets of the people on the extremes. It'll show you people who are extremely positive and people who are extremely negative. Basically, any person's post whose sentiment does not lie within the immediate vicinity of the average sentiment of one of these kinds of posts. And so that is the outline tweets feature. Of course, from here, this can be expanded to a bunch of other features, including using the IBM Watson Personality Insight service and an application of mine that you may have heard of, ScentColor, and that's coming up in part 2 of the video. However, what I'd love to do now is show you this part of tSOMA, how exactly it works, and then in part 2 we'll talk about the next version that takes this another level further. Let's get into the Mac part now, where I'll be showing you how exactly you can code in all of this using Swift and iOS, of course using the Watson Natural Language Understanding, and in this case, TwitterKit. Alright, let's get over to the coding part now. Alright, so welcome back to the code part, and now let's take a look at how exactly you can build your own version of tSOMA. Now, the storyboard for this application is a little bit more complex than we may be used to on this channel, so let's start off at the very beginning. Now, you see, I want tSOMA to be able to have a push segue, so you can actually go back, see the title, and interact with the views. And so what that means is that I need to start off with a navigation controller. And so I start off initially over here at the navigation controller, which will go ahead and push us over to the welcome page. Now, you might wonder what exactly the welcome page does if there's no button on it. This is just a bunch of labels. Well, the button does appear. You see, right under Let's Start, there's a button. You can't see it in the storyboard, though, because it's a button that Twitter is going to put in for us in the code. We'll be getting to that shortly. Now, over to the second view. Right as you've logged in with Twitter, then you're put over here, where it asks you what your search query is. Once you enter in your search query, you can click on Let's Start, and it'll move you over to this page. This is kind of the dashboard of tSOMA, your home page, say. Now, you can do a few different things. First of all, you can just search it up on Twitter, or your search query on Twitter, and it'll show you the tweets. If you click, it'll go through this segue, which will push us over to this view, which has a table view, and using our own custom code, we'll go ahead and push a bunch of tweets into the table view. If you were to go back, if you were to click the back button, since we're using the push segues in the navigation controller, then you can click on Sentiment. When you go into Sentiment, you come here. Now, I know this looks really weird, but don't worry. The chart, which shows sentiment, is actually over here in these blue boundaries. There's just a small bug in how Xcode renders this chart because it's a custom UI view, but that's all. It'll actually appear correct on the device itself. As a matter of fact, this reminds me, I'm going to be showing you a demo of tSOMA in action right after we're done the coding part. Now, if you were to go back, you can take a look at the most interesting feature, the outlying tweets, which are visible over here. Now, the way it starts off is this table view is going to show you all the tweets, and then within around 3 to 4 seconds, it's going to refresh and only show content which fits as an outlying tweet. But wait, what if there are no outlying tweets? What if everything fits the standard? What if everything fits the average? Well then, go back and head over to your settings page. Here you can actually adjust quite a few different knobs that tSOMA has. The first one is with the sentiment refresh. Now what this means is basically how often this chart is going to refresh. By default it's around 2 seconds, but we'll take a look at that in the code. In terms of outliers, you can set the amount of tweets that the outlier searches for. It is quite tweet intensive, and so make sure that if the user isn't paying, you don't allow them to search for too many tweets, because of course they're going to get over their quota quite soon. However, there's also the more interesting knob, the sensitivity. The sensitivity is basically how far away from the average a tweet needs to be in terms of sentiment to be considered an outlier. Now, by default, it's over half. I mean, it is quite large because we want to make sure that in massive amounts of tweets, you're able to find the true outliers and not just slightly deviant from the average because of, say, a machine learning error. However, you can increase this or decrease this to your will. If you decrease this, you'll probably get more tweets because they'll be closer and closer to the average. If you increase this, you'll get less and less tweets because of the fact that you're only searching for more at the extremes rather than closer to the average. And so those were all the views and how they interact with each other. Now let's take a look at the code for each of these views one by one. Let's start off with the main view controller, which is this view right over here. Now, as I mentioned, we have to insert the button for the actual login. Now, if the view controller just loads up, we'll be able to see that the Twitter kit allows us to create a button. Here we go. Now, I do define a few global variables that we're going to need throughout the view controllers. I do this so we can actually access data throughout different view controllers without having to do any fancy work. So now, as you can see, inside of the view controller, if I were to go to the view.did_load function, of course, we run the super view.did_load. This is always, this is all the same. From there, we have a new login button. So we have the Twitter login button imported from TwitterKit. And of course, I have a completion handler for once you have actually logged in, as we run this as an asynchronous task and not a synchronous task in order to make sure maximum performance and we don't hold up the UI. Now, what we're doing here is creating the button. And I'll talk about what's inside of the completion handler in just a moment. But remember, because this is an asynchronous task, what that means is that right as you run this code, this won't actually run. What's inside of this button won't actually run. Rather, it'll skip to over here. Right as you click the button, then this code is going to run. And so this is what runs first. Now, what we do is we set the center position of the login button to the center of our current view, and then from there, we add a subview to our current view, which is the login button. In fact, if I were to make this a bit easier for you to see here, there you go. So then we just add the subview, and we are good to go. We've gotten the button in the center of the screen, and we don't actually need this function as it's a leftover from an older version. I've separated this into a separate view controller entirely. There we go. Now let's talk about what happens once you log in. Now right as you click the button, you're taken over to the Twitter application where you give consent for your account to be used by my application. If you don't have the Twitter application installed, a Safari window is going to open up and you can just give your consent there, and if you're not already logged in, you can go ahead and log in. However, let's just say you do give your consent for us to use your data. Then in that case, this will go through because we'll have a new Twitter session. I can then create a new Twitter API client and pass it your user ID. I can then ask it to load your user in, give it your user ID, and then run another completion handler. Now, once the user is loaded in, then if there was an error, it's going to print out the error, or else it's going to print out nil here. And regardless of whether or not that happens, we are going to run an asynchronous task on the main thread, however, meaning that we can actually do UI updates, and I'm going to perform a segue on the current view controller, and of course the segue is query and the sender is self. If we were to go back just to tell you exactly what that is, the query segue will take us from the main view controller over to the next view of interest, and that is this view over here. And what's our story? But there we go. This view over here, which asks the user for their search query. If we were to go over to the query view controller, you can see that there's very, very, very simple code inside of this view controller. All it really does is, of course, creates a new IB outlet for the search query, which is a UI text field. And then right as they click on the start button, we set the global variable named session query, which was defined in the viewcontroller.swift file, over to the search query's text. And then we perform a segue on the self view controller. And this one's identifier is start. The sender is self. And so that is the query view controller. Extremely simple, doesn't really do real work. Now, at this point, you're in the dashboard. The dashboard doesn't have its own view controller file due to the fact that there's no real code you need to put there. It's just a place where you have a bunch of segues. In fact, that's one of the main reasons I chose to use the push segue, because it's easier to integrate navigation there instead of having to have code for all of the navigation manually. All right, so now we can talk about the first real view controller, the tweet view controller, where we actually show you a bunch of different tweets in a table view. Now, you might be wondering why the code is so short for this view controller, and well, it's short because Twitter does all the work for us. We don't need to do anything. All I do is I import the TwitterKit library, and then this view controller is actually not a regular view controller. It actually conforms to the Twitter timeline view controller. Of course, we still have viewDid load since this inherits from the view controller class. We do run the super viewDid load, and then we just set self's data source to a Twitter search timeline data source. We pass the global variable called session query that we discussed in the query view controller file, and I pass it the global variable called Twitter client because that is our API client, and that's logged into your account, so we can actually run the search. Now remember, if you were to not log into the user and just use your own API key, then in that case, you would have a lower quota because you're using, well, the developer account. And so you'd have a lower quota. Just keep that in mind as you use the service. In fact, if we were to go over to the app delegate, just to show you here, in the app delegate, I do actually take a look at Twitter, create a new shared instance, or actually access the shared instance, and start the shared instance, and I provide my consumer key and consumer secret, which will be reset after the video, just by the way. And so, yes, I do provide my API credentials in the app delegate. All right, so now that we're done this, we can go over to the sort of main view. This is what makes tSOMA what it is, and well, tSOMA. And so this is the sentiment view controller. You might be wondering why it's called the SP view controller, and that's because it's also meant to work with personality and set a color, which you'll be seeing in the next version of this application in the part 2 of this tutorial. Now, in this case, I'm importing 3 modules: TwitterKit, Alamifier, and SwiftChart. SwiftChart is an exceptional charts library. I'll be linking to its GitHub down in the description below. Alamifier is an exceptional networking library. I'll be linking to them down below as well. And of course, you know TwitterKit. They're the great social media platform that we all know and love. And of course, they provide a very, very easy to use Swift, or not Swift, iOS framework. And of course, just so you know, I am using CocoaPods. Just in case you don't know how to use CocoaPods, there is a YouTube video on my channel coming soon that will teach you a little bit more about what it is and how you can use it. Link will be down below once it's released. All right, so that is TwitterKit, and those are all the modules we're using here. Now, to begin with, I've got a very simple extension to the string class, and of course, we are parsing JSON quite a few times here, both with Twitter and with Watson, and so I do use the string extension to automatically parse a JSON string into string any for me. After that, we also have an extension to the array class. With this extension to the array class, I can easily get the average of any array into a double, almost entirely automatically, just like that. Now, if we were to continue here, as you can see, in the SP view controller itself, of course, this inherits from UI view controller, I've created myself a chart, which is the IBM variable chart. And from there, and this is also, just by the way, the chart that we control the sentiment with, and then these are the actual sort of internal variables that help us out. Now, Watson sentiments and chart data, you'll find out exactly what those do in just a moment, but essentially chart data is all the data in the chart, and Watson sentiments is all the sentiment values that we get from the tweet. So we'll be talking about that in just a moment. And of course, there's also a variable called run timer, and I'll be talking about why I need that when it comes up as well. Now, right as the unit load function begins, we actually do add to chart. Now, if you take a look at what add to chart does, is it checks if we're currently running the timer. If we are, then in that case, it's going to set Watson sentiments back to nothing because we're going to be looking through and getting the sentiment for each tweet all over again. After that, we define an optional NS error because we're most probably not going to have one, and of course, at the beginning it starts off as nil, and then I create a new URL request. So basically what this is I actually ask the Twitter client to create a URL request for me that I can send later on. So this is not an actual response that we're getting from the URL, we're just creating an NS URL request, or now renamed in Swift 3 or 4, it's now called a URL request. So I'm just using the get method. We'd have no reason to use the post method or any of the other methods. So get is the one that we use. And then the search tweets JSON is the URL string that I use. Of course, the parameters would be as in terms of the query, the actual session query, the global variable. And in terms of the result type, we want to get the most recent results first, as that'll allow us to work with the most recent tweets. And of course, I just provide a memory address or a pointer to the optional NS error. So just in case there is an error, that error is no longer optional and now contains a value. After that, I create something called a dispatch group. Now, before I continue, just in case you're unfamiliar with asynchronous tasks, make sure you watch my video on that. There's a link to it down in the description below. But essentially what a dispatch group is well, a group of asynchronous operations, or a group of operations on a dispatch thread. And essentially the reason we need a group of these is that at the end, we want to wait for all of them to complete. We don't just want to have one thing happen and then we can do the next thing inside of that asynchronous task. So we need to run a bunch of asynchronous tasks in a loop, and then after that, once they're all done, we need to be able to wait for all of them to be done so we can go over to the next step. So that's why we have a dispatch group. You'll see exactly what I'm talking about in just a moment. From there, we actually use the Twitter client that we have, again the global variable, to actually send the Twitter URL request that we had. Now, I do ignore the error because in this case, there is going to be no error. However, in order to create safer code, you can go ahead and look at that error as well. So I do pass up the URL request, and then we have a new completion handler. In this case, I look for the URL response, the data passed by it, and the error just in case there is one. And then we begin the completion handler. So I have a do statement here. Now, if, of course, all the operations within this do statement are successful, then, well, good. If they are not, however, I will print out the error's localized description, which is basically a user-friendly version of the error. Getting back over here though, once you have sent that Twitter request, then you are free to start off with the actual sort of processing. Now again, inside of this do, we print out, just in case there is an error, the actual localized description, and then after that, we start looking at the actual data sent back. So first thing I do is I convert the URL data over to JSON. Now this isn't a string, so I can't just use my string extension. I have to convert it from data to JSON. So I use the JSON serialization class. With the JSON object, I pass it my URL data, and of course I allow fragments, which is basically just some internal talk allowing it to parse JSON. You don't need to worry about all this. I don't want to confuse you with the allow fragments and all the JSON parsing. Just leave it as a black box. However, from there, we want to forcefully convert this to a string any, because all of the indexes or the indices for all the objects here are going to be strings. However, the values for these indices can be arrays, they can be strings, ints, whatever they want to be. That's why we give them an any type. From there, we create an array of tweets, in this case strings, and then I loop through the response, but not just any indice. I loop through the statuses, and of course, in this case, I treat the statuses as a string any, an array of dictionaries, and the dictionary being string any. From there, because this is a list of string any, I can loop through that list, and I is always going to be a string any. From there, I can look at the indice of I text, and I will get an any, convert that to string, and now I've got the text of the tweet, and I append that to the tweets array. Just like that, I've got all my tweets from JSON now in a very simple array that I can access natively here in Swift. Then I loop through all the tweets. Now, every single time the loops code is called, I enter my Watson group dispatch group. And so again, this is telling the dispatch group that there's a new job that has joined you. All right, from there, I create the credential data. These are my credentials for the IBM Watson Natural Language Understanding Service. And then I create an Alamofire request. And so, of course, I pass it the REST API URL for natural language understanding. I tell it that I want to use the get method, and the parameters are going to be the version, in this case 2017-02-27. If there's a new version, you can always put that in. Of course, the text in this case is going to be the tweet, which is I, and the features that we're looking for in this case are only sentiment, because we don't want anything else. However, and of course, I use a little bit of different terminology in my whiteboard and emotion sentiment, but what we're gathering here is indeed sentiment information. In terms of the HTTP headers, though, that we're sending, I'm only going to be sending the credential data, so Watson knows that it's me and not some random person that's trying to get into the service. I'm then going to validate this request, and as long as it's good, I should get a response. Now, right as I get a response, I've got a completion handler that handles that Watson underscore response. Now, I do have an if-let statement to make sure that I do actually get a Watson response. So if let Watson rest is equal to Watson response.result.value, if this is true, then I just append that Watson sentiment to an array. Now, this looks really complex, doesn't it? But really all it is we're taking a look at the result that Watson gave us. We took a look at the sentiment value, we look at the document value, and we look at the score value. Now, this is a perfect example of where languages like Node.js or Python are superior. With Swift, you don't get very good JSON handling because of the way it handles these variables in such a type-safe way. However, you can use libraries like Swifty.json in order to combat this for you. And very soon, thanks to, for example, what Chris Latner is doing with the Python glue, we should be getting the dynamic callable and dynamic members, dynamic member lookup into classes, which will allow us to have even better JSON handling very soon, hopefully.
However, for now, we do we do create sort of ugly code with what Swift has, and then just append that to Watson's sentiments. After that, I just print that out, print out the entire array actually, just for debugging purposes. Again, the user never sees any of the print statements. Just for debugging purposes, it's always good to have that there. And then once the Alamify request is done, I then leave the Watson group. What that enables me to do is enter every time something starts, and then leave when something ends. When the dispatch group sees that everything has left and now there's nothing left to leave, then it will tell me everything's done, you can continue your code. And so that is that. Now, outside of this for I in tweets loop comes this interesting part where we update the UI. Now, of course, we want to go back to the main thread. We can do this as an asynchronous task, because we don't want to sort of force ourselves into the synchronous tasks. But it's on the main thread, so we can update the UI. Now, what I'm doing is I'm actually creating another asynchronous task inside of here. Not an asynchronous task, but I'm actually telling the Watson group to notify this block of code right as the Watson group has seen all of its members leave, and so now there's nothing left in the Watson group. And I'm telling it to run this on the main queue as well. So we probably don't need this, but to stay on the safe side, I'm doing it. And so I'm running this on the main queue so we can update the UI within this block of code. Now, right as this block of code is executed, then we're going to do a few things. The first thing is we're going to keep a track ourselves of the chart data. What I mean by this is that we're going to get the average, remember the average I was talking about, the array extension, of the Watson sentiments, and then we're going to append that average over to chart data. Now, if the chart data count is greater than 60, then we remove the very first from that chart data, and then we remove all of the values from the actual chart that's on screen. And so basically, we remove older values as we get newer values if there are more than 60 of them. Then what I do is I create a new chart series. A chart series is part of the Swift charts library, and I pass it the array that we just created, which is the chart data array. I tell it that the area is true in the chart series. This really doesn't matter to you. And then from there, I add this chart series over to my chart. I set the minimum y coordinate to -1 and the maximum y to, minimum y to -1, maximum y to +1. And you know why if you've watched the whiteboard part of the video, because of NLU sentiment being from a range of -1 to 1. And then from there, I create a new timer, and this is a scheduled timer with a specific timer interval. In this case, this is the global variable sentiment refresh. Now, this is by default set to, let's see how many seconds. This is set to 2.5 seconds, and the reason it's 2.5 and not, say, 1 is so that we can keep the quota and still get relatively real-time results. Now, I'm telling this not to repeat, so it's basically telling Swift, all right, after 2.5 seconds, execute this block of code, but don't execute it every 2.5 seconds. And then from there, all I do is I take this A, which is the timer, and then I tell it, and then in the timer, I execute the add to chart function, which is the function that this is in. And of course, at the end here, I do print out the Watson sentiments, and you already saw what happens in the catch. Now, the reason this happens is basically every time the add to chart function is called, it'll add one extra value to the chart, and then once it's done adding everything to the chart, then after that, 2.5 seconds later, it's going to add to chart again. The reason I implemented this feature is because let's just say your internet connection's bad, or Watson's slow, or the TwitterKit library isn't responding correctly, and it takes 3 seconds to get your chart values. Then in that case, you don't want that before you got your first value, you've already created a task to get your second set of values. And so right after those 3 seconds are done, then wait 2.5 seconds, then get the next set of values. And hopefully it's not very noticeable because it takes relatively the same amount of time for each query to go through in the first place. And so that is how the sentiment personality works. And so actually quite simple logic because Watson takes care of all the machine learning for us. And again, the best part is that we're using, well, machine learning technology. We're not just doing, all right, if they use a bad keyword, it's negative. If they use a positive keyword, it's positive. But rather, we're actually taking a look at the true meaning and context of the sentence itself from a very, from a perspective where we can actually understand natural language. That's the power of machine learning. That's why Watson is so good. I literally have 104 lines of code, and I've created an entire application that grabs tweets and sends them through machine learning software and does this almost instantly on the cloud. It's just great. From there, though, is the outlier view controller. This is sort of where the interesting part comes in. And also, there is one function that I did forget to mention for the SP view controller, and that is view will disappear. The point of view will disappear is basically to set runtime to false and set the global variable average sentiment to the average of the Watson sentiments. Now, the reason we do this is because of two things. First of all, let's just say you started a timer task to look at your, or not you started, right after we got a value, we started the timer to actually call add to chart 2.5 seconds later. Now, before those 2.5 seconds, let's just say you leave the view. Then in that case, even though you've left the view, you're going to be calling add to chart and unnecessarily wasting quota and looking through the tweets. And so if runtime is false, it will not run, and therefore it will not call itself over and over and over again. And so we can stop the loop right there. And also, we set the global variable average sentiment to the average of the Watson sentiments because of the plain and simple fact that let's just say you go to the outlier view. And in that case, the outlier view needs to know what the average sentiment is in order to give you what the outliers are. Now, getting over to the outliers, this is again a Twitter timeline view controller. However, there are a few differences. This is a bit more complex. So first of all, what I do is I take a look at a bunch of tweet IDs, or I create an array of a bunch of different tweet IDs that I want to show in my view, in my table view. And then I'd also create a dictionary of tweet ID to sentiment. So this is string double because the tweet IDs are stored in strings and the sentiments are stored in doubles. And I also set a variable, which is max tweets, which is the number of tweets that I want to look at. And of course, a local variable. And so if we were to scroll down here, we can see that we do not indeed use that local variable. All right, perfect. So next up, in the viewDidLoad function, the first thing that I do is I call the getTweets function. Now, this class also has its own getTweets function, which is right over here. Now, this getTweets function is actually quite special, and the reason it's special is because it's also slightly recursive. What that means is that, see, when you search for tweets on Twitter, it'll give you a few results at a time, say 10 tweets at a time in one response. And then what it says is, all right, if you want more responses, then what you have to do is you have to use this ID and then call the API again with that ID, and we'll give you the next page results. And so basically, the next result here is an optional string. If you're calling getTweets for the first time, then you don't want to give next results because this is the first set of results that you're getting. However, if getTweets is calling itself to get a next page of results, that's when it's actually going to fill out that variable. Now, of course, this is mostly the same content as last time, but I'll go through a little bit of it just so you get a good idea. Of course, I do declare an error and a new URL request, and I check, is next results nil? If it is not, then I set its value into next page, which of course is done through an if-let statement. If indeed we do have a next results page, then what I do is I tell the Twitter client to create a URL request for me, of course the get method. However, this time, not only do I provide the tweets.json, but I tell it that I'm looking for the next page. And of course, from there, I tell it I don't want any parameters because I don't need any, and I provided a pointer to the error just in case there is one. However, if there's no next results page, then we do the exact same thing as we did in the sentiment view controller by providing the parameters of the session query, and we want the most recent tweets, but in this case, we also tell it that the amount of tweets we want are the outlier tweets. And so, of course, we don't need max tweets because we use the global variable of outlier tweets. There we go. Of course, we do give it the error pointer as well. And so this is where the same part comes in. See, we create the Watson group in order to tell when everything is done, and then we send our Twitter request over to Twitter. We look for the response and the error and the data. We print out the error if there is any, or the localized description of it. We go ahead and parse out the data from Twitter. And then what I do is, first of all, is I create a new variable for the next results page. If there is a next results page, then I set it, or I put its value into the next results page variable. After that, what I do is I loop through all of the different tweets. Every time I loop through a tweet, I enter the Watson group and I create a new variable or constant called tweet text, which is equal to that specific tweet's text. And then we do the exact same thing as we did last time with Watson. We create the credential data and we create an Alamify request to access Watson. Now, once we get a response, though, we do something slightly different. Of course, we still parse the sentiment, but then what I do is I get the absolute value of the average sentiment minus the current tweet sentiment. Now, if I actually get this value, and of course I also do get the absolute value of this average sentiment and the absolute value of the sentiment itself before I get the absolute value of them negated. And the reason I do this is because I always want a positive number. I don't want positives and negatives combined, because all I'm looking for is a difference, right? Like, for example, how far off is this sentiment from the average sentiment? Now, if this difference number is greater than the sensitivity, which is a global variable that's adjustable, then in that case, append the ID of this tweet to self.tweetIDs and also set this tweet ID's sentiment in the tweet sense variable or dictionary to the sentiment. Now, of course, if there is no sort of sentiment, or if the sentiment is very close, or it's not part of the sensitivity, then in that case we just append a blank tweet ID, and then we leave the Watson group. That's how that works. Now, of course, we still do the same Watson group notify on main thread thing. And then, now that I think about it, we do need max tweets, because max tweets, what it's going to allow us to do is this. You see, with max tweets, we can see exactly how many tweets we want to check in terms of tweet IDs. And so if we were to say if self.tweetids.count is less than self.maxTweets and the next results page is nothing, meaning, in essence, that we've collected the amount, or we have not collected the maximum number of tweets, and there's still a next page to go to because it's not blank, then in that case, call get tweets all over again and tell it that the next results page is the next results page that we had already gathered. However, if there is no next results page, or if we've reached the maximum number of tweets, then go ahead and print out all the tweet IDs, and while this tweet IDs contains blank, meaning that while there's a blank string inside of tweet IDs, then go ahead and remove each of those blank tweet IDs. And of course, just for debugging purposes, print out the while just to make sure we're not getting into an infinite while loop. After that, print out the tweet IDs once more, print out the sentiments for each tweet ID, and then call the create collection function. Now, create collection is actually the sort of graphic part. Basically, what we do here is create the Twitter request to actually get the text for each and every tweet, or the actual tweet itself. And then what I do is I go ahead and run a bunch of logic that will allow us to put all of the tweets that we gathered into the actual view controller's table view. Now, the way I do this is by creating a tweet collection. Now, what's a tweet collection, you may ask? Basically, what I do is I take a bunch of tweet IDs and I tell Twitter, create a collection out of these IDs. Now, the collection is labeled under the user's account since they logged in. Now, the collection also has a custom identification ID, which is given to us as well right here. Now, once that collection is created and we have the ID, we're able to go ahead and tell Twitter to use that collection as a data source. Because very unfortunately, the TwitterKit SDK doesn't just allow me to pass a bunch of tweet IDs to use as a data source. That's definitely a recommendation that I have for them to add into their SDK. So I have to go through all of this code to create a collection and then use that collection as a data source. But anyway, at least I'm able to. So I take that collection, give it over to the Twitter collection timeline data source, and set the self.data source over to it. And then do self.refresh, and there we go. We refresh the table view, and we're good to go. Now, of course, there are a few things that you can experiment with, like, for example, if you can use touches began and touches moved with force ID in order to create a more advanced version, but that's for version 2. Of course, there is just a little utility function called random string, which is used to create IDs over here as well. And now finally, very simple, the settings view controller, which allows us to have a refresh slider, a sensitivity slider, and a tweet slider, so we can actually set each and every one of those variables. When we do the view did load, we set those sliders values to the actual global variables values, and when we do view will disappear, we set those global variables values to the values of those sliders. And so every time you close the view, you set the values of the global variables. Every time you load the view, you actually get the values of the global variables and put them into your sliders. And so that was all the code that went behind tSOMA. Now that you understand it, of course, all the code will be available in the description below, so you can download it and use it yourself and expand it to really whatever you'd like it to be. However, now it's time for a little more. It's time for a demo of tSOMA in action. Let's take a look.
Alright, so as you can see, this is tSOMA open up on my iPhone. So let's go ahead and begin by logging in with Twitter. I'm going to click login with Twitter, and as you can see, it forwards me to my Twitter application. I can click the connect button on the bottom right, and I can go ahead and open tSOMA back up. tSOMA realizes that the session has been created and allows me to enter my search query. Now, let's just say my search query is hashtag, or actually at Apple, or actually, you know what, let's go hashtag WWDC. WWDC. There we go. Because WWDC is coming up June 4th and is currently June 2nd, or, well, now June 3rd, technically. So I'm going to click on Let's Start. And there we go. Let's begin by seeing some tweets just so we can take a look at some of the tweets. Alright, so as you can see, some people are arriving at WWDC. There are a few different banners. People are tweeting about what to expect, their wish lists, all this kind of stuff. So let's just go back. And let's head over to sentiment. Now, this is exactly what we want to see. What do people think about WWDC? Let's find out. Alright, so as you can see, generally people are positive. In fact, for the next minute, I'm going to keep this going, see if we get any real-time activity, and I'm going to actually fast-forward this so you don't need to sit through tSOMA actually coming through all the data. Alright, as you can see, not enough people are tweeting about WWDC for us to see anything in real time. However, if they were, we'd be able to see real-time updates of this graph as the tweets were happening. If you were to choose a topic that's currently trending, it would... oh, there we go, it moved. So now, of course, let's just say Apple releases something at WWDC someone doesn't like. This will definitely go down. But now, we have to realize that the average sentiment is positive. And so, of course, some people are going to have negative reactions. So let's go back and see some of the negative reactions. Now, as you can see, these are all the tweets. Let's go ahead and wait for it to filter. Alright, there we go. As you can see, it is filtered, and now it's showing things that are really positive, like, for example, as you can see, Mr. B seeing the dark mode of Xcode 10 in Mac OS. Its name is unknown so far, which actually does look great, but that's extremely positive. And so, because it's so positive and because it is abnormally positive, it's showing us that outlying tweet. So is Denny's, and of course lots of other people as well. Now, if we go back, we might be able to get more relevant or less relevant tweets if we go to the settings and adjust the sensitivity. Maybe we search more tweets, and let's just crank up the sensitivity a little bit to get even more farther away tweets. So now let's wait maybe 5 seconds, and we should get a result. We should see, there we go, as you can see, the sensitivity was just too high. If I go back, however, and if I set the sensitivity a bit lower, maybe, we should be able to see maybe some less sort of outlying tweets, maybe less abnormal. Wait for a few seconds, though. There we go. So as you can see, we are still getting some that are extremely positive. In fact, I can actually tell there are barely any negative tweets about WWDC, and not surprising, but yeah, there are barely any negative tweets, which proves that tSOMA works. Alright, so that was a quick demo of tSOMA in action. I do hope you enjoyed this tutorial of using and actually developing Tanmay Social Media Analyzer. So that was all I had for you in this tutorial. I really do hope you enjoyed and you were able to learn from this tutorial. If, of course, you do have any questions, suggestions, or feedback, please do leave them down in the comment section below. Tweet them to me at @tadgmanny on Twitter or email them to me at tadgmanny@gmail.com. Apart from that, if you really do enjoy my content and you want to see more of it, please do consider subscribing to the YouTube channel, as it really does help out a lot. And if you think this video could be helpful to anyone you know, like your friends or family, please do consider sharing the video as well. Apart from that, though, if you would like to be notified whenever I release new content, please do consider turning on the bell icon down below, as it really does help. And that's all I have for this video. Thank you very much, everyone. Goodbye.